Hello, 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 everyone. Welcome to another episode of Hayden's Happy Hour. I'm very excited to have a guest with us, and I'm very excited to talk about philosophy and epistemology and critical thinking, and something that's sorely lacking in our education system and in our society today. And I found him on TikTok, and I was really intrigued by his videos and what he had to say. So please welcome Joe, formalthoughtlabs.com, Joe.
Hey, Hayden. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Hey, I'm really excited to have you on, and I wanted to start today by shouting out your website and what you're all about. So can you share your TikTok name and where people can find you before we get into it?
Yeah, formalthought.joe is my TikTok. Should also be good for Instagram and Twitter. The website is formalthoughtlabs.com. Very new. I only joined TikTok in the beginning of October, and it just kind of exploded from there. Then I went through an existential crisis, and decided to, kind of make a go of this as my new personal mission.
Cool. So what is that mission?
Well, I really believe that formal thought, critical thinking, philosophy should be a bedrock of education starting in fifth grade. That a lot of the problems that we see today with lack of critical thinking, anti-thought, and anti-science, mostly science denial, is really due to people's broken epistemology, their indoctrination into being able to believe things with no evidence, and then their conspiratorial mess, the soup that they get in, kind of as a result of that. And so, my actual mission there is to promote critical thinking and formal logic to students, parents, and to critical thinking allies.
Okay, that's awesome, man. I agree with you 100%. I wasn't able to discover philosophy until I was in higher education. It's not taught in K-12 at all in America.
No, and I believe that's the big, you hear a lot, especially from the far right, about how colleges are these liberal indoctrination incubators.
Yeah.
And my point of view, not having gone to college, by the way, and being a GOP poster child, having a homestead, raising 6 kids as a homeschool parent, having a business for 17 years, I firmly believe that, it's really when you send kids who have been indoctrinated into religion or into a false sense of believing something without evidence, that they go to college and they start to question those beliefs. They're introduced to actual formal thought, whether it's actual philosophy through a class or just by nature of having to think and seeing other people's point of view. And that opens their mind to realizing, oh shit, everything I was taught, maybe I should start questioning that. And then when they bring those questions back home, oh my God, now they're indoctrinated into a liberal ideology. It's a bunch of bullshit. It's it's completely ridiculous. And that's why I think it should start so young.
Well, I agree with you completely on that, because I think that a lot of times when you have these incubators, I had a good friend on yesterday, and we were talking about how our education system isolates people in one area and one way of thinking their whole lives. And then when they get out of that, college is the first time they've experienced someone with a different background than them, and they begin to question those ideas they were brought up with. There's a lot of people that go to elementary, middle, and high school in the same campus and the same people, and they never are outside of their little bubble. And I think that if we started, teaching the Socratic method, or perhaps having some sort of logic education in middle school and high school, we would have kids that could form their own beliefs, and I think they'd be stronger individuals for it.
I agree, and they'd be better citizens to the republic.
Yeah, and I think that when we look at someone like Plato, all the way back in ancient Greece, democracy failed because education was only given to the elites. And so when you see that, you can see how that's happening here as well. Would you agree with that statement?
Yeah, I have a little bit of a problem with it. Being a homeschool parent. I had to kind of dive into different curriculum, right, to figure out what's going on. And the public school system, as good as it was when it was first started to rise people out of poverty and give people for the first time real sense of math and science and critical thinking and reading, when you look at it, obviously the critique now is that it's really geared to promote workers. Mm-hmm. That it's the show up on time, do the work you're supposed to do, be that cog in the machine. And I even think private schooling has this problem. Before that, there was the standard method of teaching with a governor or governess, was a very well-rounded education with a cornerstone in philosophy. And so I don't even think the aristocracy now is getting that critical thought, as you can see through the Trump family and, Koch brothers, like all these people with abundance of wealth and still have tinfoil hats.
Yeah.
So I think it's ruining everybody.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. And, that's a great expansion of that idea to take it all the way out. Even if you have money, you still don't have access to quality education until you get into college. And I wanted to go back to something you said earlier about higher education being looked at as a liberal indoctrination thing. And I think that what people confuse is that liberalism is not inherently right or left. I think that people confuse those two things. You can be a liberal conservative or a liberal leftist. There's leftists that believe in free speech that are sort of the minority in the communism side of the area, because communism is sort of oppressive in its own way. And then you have liberals on the right who are maybe, and this is something that's lost in America, but they're more fiscally conservative and yet still want to allow everyone to speak their mind. And I think that it shows a lack of confidence on both of these sides of the political spectrum that free speech is sort of something that's being demonized. And, we're promoting this sort of censorship on both sides.
Yeah, I mean, what's going on, I don't see it as censorship in any way, right? I mean, strictly defining censorship is really about government's control of your right to speak your mind. Mm-hmm. As a capitalist society, where the individual owns the means of production, they can serve who they want. This is what free market's about. And if you break my terms of service, you're gone.
Yeah.
I don't have to serve you.
Yeah.
If you're an asshat, I don't have to serve you. And that is within my right to do that. That's not censorship.
Okay. Yeah. I see what you're saying. I guess what we're talking about is sort of the idea of deplatforming. And so what the question I guess we have to get into is, where do these services become a public good versus a private good? So that's kind of the distinction you're starting to look at.
Yeah, I mean, if they're owned by the government themselves, then the right of free speech should be taken very seriously. If, for instance, let's say Twitter was owned by the United States government, then you have a terms of service violation that you could invoke, and it still not be censorship. You just broke the rules of the game. Yeah. If you break the rules of the game, you don't get to play. Yeah. But since they are private companies, they don't even need a TOS. Mm-mm. They can just say, "You're gone. I don't want to play with you anymore. Bye." Yeah. And as a privately owned company in a free market, they completely have the right to do that.
Yeah. So that's a good distinction, not to call it censorship, but deplatforming is there, right? Because it's their platform.
That's right.
Yeah, that's a good distinction to make. Do you think there should be a service that is owned by the government that is an internet-based platform for speech? Do you think that's a good idea or a bad solution to this issue?
Well, you have to start with, will it gain any ground, right? Because a platform doesn't mean anything if no one's there to use it.
Exactly.
There's 50 people there. No one's going to care about it.
Yeah.
So will the government even be able to do that? I mean, as a technologist, my company is a software company. I'm a senior systems architect for 20 years. The government has a hard time putting together technological stuff, as much in support of the Affordable Care Act. Their rollout on their technology portion of what they did was horrendous. They spent way too much. It took way too long. It was way too buggy. I could have had a team together and rebuilt that in 6 months for a tenth of the cost. So do I think the government should control a new technology? They could. I wouldn't be against it. I just don't think anyone would play. I don't think that, people would be super willing to go onto a government-owned platform, put in their private information, and talk and have their free speech there.
Yeah.
I think people would be really resistant to that. So regardless of whether or not they should, the question is whether or not they can. And it's not just technologically can they, because eventually they can. It'll be fine. Like, the technology now for ACS is just fine. The question is, will people play? And obviously, there are people on the far left and far right there would be no way that they would participate on that platform.
Yeah, that's 100% true. And the public square is only a public square if the public's there. That
That's
was a little too rhymey, but
I mean, look at C-SPAN, right? I mean,
yeah.
It's on cable news, but nobody listens to it. Most people get their political news from the news organizations that they have an affiliation to. But we're talking mostly boomers here, right? Because Gen Xers, millennials, Gen Zs, they don't typically get their news from the network television anymore. And so everybody kind of goes to their preferred platform to get that information, which in and of its own self is problematic because then you end up with echo chambers and confirmation bias. But we are in an infancy in the internet. The internet as we know it was born in 95. I graduated in 93, right? So I was 20 years old when the internet was born. So I watched it. And then I got involved, and my company is an internet-based company, very successful. And without the internet, I wouldn't be able to do what I did. But it's still in its infancy. Social media, really, you're looking at 05, 06.
Yeah.
And so we're only 15 years into this, and so I think Gary Vaynerchuk, I'm a fan of his from a marketing point of view. He often says technology doesn't change us; it exposes us.
Yep.
This is like with Trump and the birther movement, where this whole mess originated from. It's just an echo chamber, and we're poorly behaved right now. Bad behavior is exposed. And now that it's exposed, we can actually address it. The Me Too movement, BLM, movements like that are now able to take root. And look at Arab Springs, what they were able to do with the internet. And, if Tiananmen Square had the internet, it might have been a completely different situation. So we have a long way to go. I think ultimately it's going to prove very positive, but we've got to go through some growing pains, and we've got to discover stuff about ourselves that many people have hidden in the closet for a long freaking time. Their racism and bigotry and so forth. Now it's all out for everybody to see, which I'd rather try to boil that frog in already boiling water than turn it up slowly and boil everybody. So it's a very interesting time we live in.
Yeah, it's definitely, we're talking about living in history right now. This will definitely be a time that's written about in the history books, 2020 with the global pandemic and all of the things in regard to that. And I go back to thinking about the psychoanalysts when you brought up the internet kind of exposing us. I think in a certain sense, you could think that the internet's kind of brought up our deepest, darkest shadow of ourselves. The thing we used to keep private with our family and friends is now on the internet for people who agree with us to see, and anyone can see it. So, the racist things that people used to say in their living rooms are now on Facebook.
Exactly.
And it's, both dark but you also see the good side of humanity on the internet as well. I mean, think of the charity that has been done on the internet through platforms like GoFundMe and that sort of thing.
Well, and the access to education material, right? Mm-hmm. As I said, I didn't go to college, but I've had 3 STEM careers. I was a biomedical polymer research and development chemist before I found my love for computers and then got into computers. And I wouldn't have been able to do either of those things if I didn't have access to knowledge and information via the internet that used to be afforded only to kids who spent 4 to 8 years in college. Mm-hmm. And so utilizing that tool, I think, is a very powerful thing. We sit around the dinner table now and have discussions. And if we have a data point that we don't know, when I was growing up, we'd guess. And then everybody said, I researched it, which is a bunch of bullshit. No one actually looked it up, went to the library, to the card catalog system, found a book on the topic, went and pulled the book, found the index, went through, opened the page. You know what I mean? Now you just ask Google or Siri, and bam, you have your answer. What was the largest dinosaur? What is the bite force of a tiger? Right. So it's pretty remarkable.
Yeah. And I think it's made us in some ways less willing to think critically. And I think that's sort of the problem you're addressing, is that the internet has sort of, in its infancy, allowed us to put some of our thinking off to this technology rather than doing any sort of reading for ourselves. We just think Google will do it for me. And so I think that part of the problem with these technologies is that it sort of allows us to not research and not learn.
I think that critical thinking needs to be a bedrock to start with. And once you have that, then you can get the information that you need. But if you're relying on it to do your thinking for you, like echo chambers, QAnon, tinfoil conspiracies, flat earth, like all this crazy, you can go confirm what you suspect by typing it into the Google box and getting that result out of it. But I think that problem has existed for a long freaking time, right? Now, instead of being the one crazy one in town, you can go find all the other one crazy ones in their respective towns and go, see, I'm right.
Yeah.
So that definitely is a problem.
Yeah. So it's interesting that you say you're a homesteader with homeschooling, because I have experiences where that's gone completely the other way, where I know people that use it as an indoctrination camp for their own religious viewpoint, and they teach creationism. And to get onto the second part of what you started with is the science denial part. To get into that, we have a whole swath of this country that believes the earth is 6,000 years old and was created in 6 days. And I don't think people understand how harmful this viewpoint is. To me, it's all right on the line of religious freedom, because the implications of believing this are massive.
It breaks people's epistemology. When you tell a 6-year-old in Bible school, no, that's not a question we asked. Here's what we want you to think. And you don't ask questions and you don't question authority. You just accept it as is. You're snuffing out their intellectual curiosity.
Yep.
I believe as a homeschool parent, my number one job is to install intellectual curiosity. Everything else will take care of itself. If I can do that and they know how to read, I'm done, because they will go find the answers. They'll go get passionate about a subject and we'll help them through that subject and explore from a twofold. One is being okay with saying, I don't know, and not asserting something. Humans have a big problem with that. It shows up in our evolutionary history. 200,000 years ago, when the wind blew the grass, our ancestors had 2 ways to go about it. They either get curious or they were fearful and ran. The ones who were fearful and ran spread their faulty DNA everywhere. And the ones who were curious often got eaten by the lion. And so our genes are based off those fear responses, giving agency to things like the wind. And it's ingrained part. That's why philosophy is so important, because it goes against your pre-programming. Your brain's ability to take shortcuts. So it doesn't have to relearn everything, but those biases can be really harmful. Religion has figured out over thousands of years how to use that to keep people in the faith.
Yeah, and I think that's 100% true. When you look at I read an article about having a crying night at Bible camp. They literally tried to invoke this emotional response to their sermons to use that shortcut. And then the brain associates the emotional response with the deity or with a spirit that resides within. And so then it's a very powerful tool to keep you in this vicious circle of ideology.
Exactly.
And I think, it's not fair to children.
Yeah. I mean, as Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens often pointed out, it's a form of child abuse.
Yeah, it is. And I have no problem with someone being religious, but I think that they should allow their children to decide on their own whether they're going to follow in that religion or not. I think that's part of our duty as adults, is to, like you said, raise intellectually curious children. And if you have faith in your ideas, then you wouldn't be so insecure about them. is been my viewpoint is if you thought your ideas were good, why are you so insecure?
Yeah, I mean, me being very precise with words, trying to be very precise with words, faith is simply belief without evidence, right?
Yes.
Where your belief can be right or wrong, and knowledge is objectively true.
Yes.
And so when you have faith, you're really saying, I give up my ability to actually think about it, and I'm just going to accept it.
Yep.
And that is what's dangerous to teach kids.
Yes.
Is that blind faith.
Yes. And, faith, you can have faith in science. There can
I would say you would have belief in science.
Okay. Well, what I would say is that faith for me comes from, I have faith that science will eventually be able to answer the questions we can't answer now. Does that
Sure.
make sense?
And I would consider that faith, because you have no evidence that we will get to the end.
Yes.
Right. That we will understand quantum gravity, that we will understand the nanosecond before and after the Big Bang.
Mm-hmm.
So I agree with that.
Yeah. And like you said, that's important to make precision there, because that could be, then you could have someone who's a religious person say, well, science is the same as religion, when it is not.
And in that context, they may have a valid argument. You presupposing that we will eventually reach that conclusion because you don't have evidence for it, right? Same as where they don't have evidence that, I have no evidence, thereby God, right?
Yeah.
This argument from ignorance, the fallacy. So
the God of the gaps argument that's often
right.
comes up in religion. Well, your science can't do this, so therefore my religion.
That's right.
So is there any kind of curriculum you'd like to elaborate on that you teach in your own homeschooling that you do to instill critical thought?
Well, it's a little hard to explain. Obviously, we use source material, and I have a book list on my blog that people could find. And there's some children's books that we use as source material as well.
Mm-hmm.
But we take what's traditionally called an unschooling approach.
Okay.
Where we don't have, there are times when they have to sit in front of a computer for 45 minutes and do their math exercises, or, we allow them time to study history, and we kind of steer them in that direction. But overall, it's never not school, right? So it's always discussion. It's always questioning. It's always answering their questions or finding out things, right? We encourage that 24/7 from the time they wake up to the time they're going to sleep. It's constant conversation. It's an ongoing effort. And it encompasses everything we do, whether we're cooking, and so then we're talking about fractions and measurements and mixtures versus solutions, or homesteading, where we're learning how to grow our own food and why microbials in the soil are important, to, how to eviscerate a chicken. It's always, for us, it's always an educational opportunity. In that environment, it's impossible not to teach critical thinking.
Okay. Yeah.
Because everything is, and more than anything else, it's modeling. Being able to say, I don't know, let's go find out, right? That they don't take us as the authority on anything that we're not an expert in. I happen to be an expert in a handful of fields, but I stick to those areas. I do not claim expertise in things I don't know, right? This whole Dunning-Kruger effect that we see everywhere. Yes. Like the pandemic, it's ridiculous. Like people see 3 YouTube videos and they hear from Bobby at the Quickie Mart, and suddenly they feel they have a better grasp on epidemiology than someone who spent 12 years in school and 20 years in the field. It's just absolutely completely ridiculous. So we modeled that good behavior of saying, I don't know, let's go find out, speaking towards things that we know and discovering things that we don't.
Okay, so I like that a lot. So it's almost school is never out of session.
That's right. That's exactly right.
Yeah, that's a good approach. And like you said, it goes back to the era before we had public schooling, which has its faults, but it also has its benefits. But I think a lot of times we look at public school now as a daycare rather than an education.
100%. Yeah, and we saw that with the parents, not being able to deal with virtual school. It's like, oh, how am I going to go to work, or how am I going to deal with work if my kids are home, and what are they doing? And it absolutely is a daycare first, as far as I'm concerned, because parents take the easy way out, and they don't get involved in their child's education to any significant degree.
And I am blessed because I had a mom who would come in every night and we read every single night, and I got to pick the books. She had a stack of books and she said, "You go pick one." And, she made me curious and she made me want to learn things. And I remember, I don't know if you've ever had your kids read The Phantom Tollbooth.
No,
By Norton Jester. He's an architect and philosopher, intellectual, as well as a children's author. And basically what he does is he teaches relativity and the idea of the difference between language and mathematics through allegory in this story. So that would be something you could definitely use in your homeschooling.
Yeah, just jotted it down.
Yeah, and so it's and he he explored the idea of the limits of language and the idea of the limits of mathematics through these whimsical characters. And I realized when I got into my philosophy class that I'd been learning about Wittgenstein and Bertrand Russell's exploration of mathematical logic at age 11, reading this children's book. And I was like, I related it to all this, and I realized that was a gift my mom gave me, that I had these ideas instilled in me that I couldn't verbalize, but that I had from the time I was a child.
Yeah, that's really good.
But not everyone has a parent that takes the time to educate them.
No, or that's maybe capable of it. I mean, single household families working 2 jobs, maybe didn't have the best education themselves. And I'm sensitive to that. That's why I'd really like to see this curriculum adjustment in public schools. I think it'd be the single biggest thing we can do for the Republic. If we could teach, starting at 10 years old, philosophy and formal logic, in 20 years, it would change the nation.
I agree with you 100%, because when we say children are the future, we often don't put that into practice.
That's right.
We don't invest in their future.
No, it's indoctrination. Do as I say, show up on time. It's not the importance of understanding. We don't teach to the problem, right? We just give you arbitrary facts. We teach to the tests, and it's a complete failing of our education system.
And people are hungry for this stuff.
Yeah, apparently. I showed up on TikTok. The beginning of October, I did one video on quantum physics, because I've been studying it for like 6 years as a hobby. And, I claim no expertise in the area, but I have a big interest in it. And so I've been studying it, like really studying it for the better part of 5 years. And I have a critique on it. Right? I mean, string theories, we've been doing that for 60 years, still bears no fruit. Maybe it's time to look into other areas. Sabine Holstead from Germany, she's an astrophysicist. She wrote a book called Lost in Math, where the physics community in the 80s and 90s wanted to make it beautiful. They wanted a unified field theory that could fit on a T-shirt. Right. It's a backwards way to go about it. Right. And then I'm not critiquing these guys who know far more about this subject than I do. But at the same time, it's just, she did provide the criticism with that backing.
Well, they're trying to make the tail wag the dog.
In many ways. And, as beautiful as it was, it's not going to work. So I made that video and like 30,000 people showed up. I was dumbfounded. But the conversations we had led me to believe that, oh man, people have a really gross misunderstanding of science, general pop. And I've known about it, being a scientist my whole adult life, especially starting with the climate change used as a political football. Yeah. It's absolutely ridiculous. But I started doing philosophy videos, and now what's it, October, November, December, and here we are halfway through January. So 3.5 months, 130,000 people now follow me on TikTok.
Which is crazy.
Totally insane. So you're 100% right that people are thirsty for this.
Well, and people want a sense of grounding. And I think logic and formal thought is a ground. It's like if you want to talk about a unified field, you have to have a connection to that field. So if you want to ground, you have to be able to think critically.
Yeah, I mean, otherwise you're just teaching to the tests. You're just learning to the test.
You're just floating, not knowing where to go.
Yep.
You know?
You'll be willing to believe anything if you can't really apply that. I mean, it blows me away if you think about it. Anthropologists, they argue anywhere from humans have been around between 200,000 and let's say 100,000. But let's just take the 100,000 years, right? 100,000 years. For 90,000 years, we did jack shit. We mended a couple bones. We built fires, maybe a wheel or two, right? We learned how to eat, meat properly and so forth. It was only 10,000 years ago did we make our first harvest, where civilization started. 10,000 years. And then it took another 9,000 years for us to formalize logic.
Yep.
And it was really similar timing in both Eastern and Western philosophy, from Sun Tzu, Lao Tzu, Confucius, and the other side with Socrates, Aristotle, and Plato.
Yep.
And it was a similar time period. So it took 9,000 years after the first harvest to get to that point. And then it took us another 900 years to codify it into a scientific method during the Enlightenment. We are slow.
And also, these methods all have their own limitations. They're not perfect. We can't again just swap out God for the scientific method. We have to be able to think critically and say, hey, there's limitations to this method. There's still territory to explore.
Yeah, but that's the beauty of the scientific method, right? Is that it doesn't rely on anything except for, an objective path towards truth by evidence and observation. Evidence is interesting. I'm kind of formalizing or outlining my next podcast to talk about what is evidence. And there's only two major bodies that kind of focus on evidence: law and science. Law is interesting because what they consider evidence is far more lenient what the scientific community considers evidence. Eyewitness testimony is a perfect example, right? Accepted in the court of law, you couldn't get past the lab door if you brought eyewitness testimony. Law looks at reconstructing a picture of the past in order to make a judgment call on whatever the situation is, where science uses its power for prediction. It looks towards the future. And so this is where I think that, consensus, scientific consensus, and people's gross misunderstanding of science is silly, because we use science to make predictions, which allows us to have this podcast with video and audio in real time over the internet and radio waves to make this happen. So we know it works because we predict it, and then we can confirm that prediction and observation. So,
I love the insight of psychology that says don't look at someone's words, look at someone's actions. And these science-denying religious zealots, if they have a smartphone, they're not practicing what they preach.
No.
If they're using the internet, they're not practicing what they preach.
Yeah, the technology, the arguments that they get into, and the science denial on a device created by general relativity and quantum mechanics.
Yep.
Right? I mean, it's like, what are you talking about?
Yeah. It's like, oh, this stuff doesn't work, and your angry comment shows that it does on my post. Like,
that's right.
I mean, I don't like cognitive dissonance because it's often thrown around. It's like used as just a throwaway term that you're going to throw at anything that disagrees with your path or your thought. But I think that there is a certain kind of dissonance between living in the modern world while also subscribing to this Abrahamic or Islamic traditional God. And I think this is what Nietzsche is addressing when he says God is dead. He's not talking about a mystical idea or, the modern accepting Christian religion that allows people to live freely. He's talking about this traditional idea of God as the eternal Father who is up there watching your every move and deciding what, and this Calvinist idea of predestination that's what God is dead. And he saw that there was going to be a major consequence to that. And then the 20th century happened.
Yeah, and he's still got 100 years to go, right? I mean, when he wrote that book, he gave humans 200 years to be their own philosophers.
Yep.
Right. Because the end of the 19th century kind of marked our end of philosophy having such a heavy hand in how humans govern themselves. Nietzsche is one of the last in that group. We have modern day philosophers, of course, but they don't influence governance and humanity the way that those early philosophers have. Mm-hmm. It helped us out of the forest, as it were, right? Yeah. The number of people that are capable now of holding those kinds of thoughts are growing and continuing to grow. So we're halfway through what he felt would be another kind of enlightenment where everyone could legitimately be their own philosopher. And I would say halfway through, and we've got maybe a quarter of the population who are, on that journey. And then, of course, we'll see the curve there increase as more people get a hold of it. So
I agree with you completely. And I think that I'm striving to be that. I'm striving to be my own philosopher. And with this podcast, I'm trying to encourage other people to do that. And I think that's what you're doing with your TikTok and your podcast and your website.
That's exactly right.
And, I think that people often mischaracterize Nietzsche as anti-faith or anti-religion, and he was not. He actually loved the Old Testament, and he was actually against the sort of idea of the New Testament, which is a weird sort of way to think about his philosophy. But at the same time, I think he was talking about the fact that humans need some sort of ground, and he thought that without a God, perhaps we would have no ground and perhaps our morality would suffer.
Yeah, and he was worried about the nihilistic tendencies of a godless world. But again, he was a product of his own generation.
Yeah.
You see this everywhere. Arthur Conan Doyle is my favorite example of this, where he created one of the best characters of critical thought in history with Sherlock Holmes. But he himself was so succumbed to his own bias. He believed in the craziest shit ever.
Yeah.
Fairies and all kinds of nut stuff. So people can be genius and still an asshat.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, Aristotle and Socrates, another example, very misogynistic, very how do you say aristocracy, but aristocratal?
Aristocratic.
Yeah, there you go. Thank you. You got to take the good and toss the bad, and people are fallible. This is whitewashing of history, right?
Yep.
People are just people. Yeah, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson wrote an amazing document. They were also slaveholders.
Yep.
Martin Luther King, incredible civil rights leader, also a really bad husband.
Yep.
People are people across the board. And the sooner we realize that, the sooner we can see our own faults and work to address them.
I can see in myself, my biases when I'm thinking. I often will jump to, because it's attractive to me, sort of the Alan Watts idea of the mystical energy. And I sort of jump to that bias, and I kind of go away from science because I think it's a nice sort of way to look at the universe, but it may not be correct.
Yeah, the one I'm guilty of is my wife was way more anti-theist than I have been in the past. I think I'm starting to pass her up the more I see the detriment. But in my early 20s, I was always like, I get it. But man, it always bothered me. 6.5 billion people. How could they all be wrong? We have this such small, this ad populum argument, and it's completely ridiculous. It's because it's hardwired into our DNA.
Yeah.
We need to give agency to things we don't understand. It's easier for us to come up with an explanation without evidence than to say, I don't know.
Yeah.
And the whole reason I got into philosophy, it wasn't, again, I didn't go to college. I didn't go to school. So I didn't study this academically. I studied this as a requirement to grow my business because my ego was getting in the way.
Yeah.
I had too much bias, and I was going to be able to do X, Y, Z when I really needed to entrust others to carry some of those missions forward. So that's how I got into philosophies, getting some business coaching from some heavy hitting business people, and really starting to study business and how other people thought about it. And then it just kind of went on from there.
Okay, so how has philosophy aided you in your business specifically with dealing with others? You kind of talked about it, but can you elaborate on that a little bit for me?
Yeah, I can't necessarily say like, here's the Socrates quote that made me a better business person.
Yeah.
And I've always been, again, science minded, and wanted to kind of believe I was thinking critically. But, as a polymath, I have a lot of skills that I do really well.
Mm-hmm.
And here's a good example. As we started getting more employees, it was hard for me not to jump in and help.
Uh-huh.
And when I do that, especially in the beginning, before I've kind of taken the more leadership approach, moved from, manager to executive. Mm-hmm. As I'm more of a manager, I would jump in and I would do what I do and just kill it, whether it's code or marketing or, copy. And eventually I'd see it on my employees' faces like, well, why am I even here? If Joe's going to outdo me every time he comes in, then why am I here? He doesn't need me. He's going to do it better than I do. And that became a major problem because I was, the business coach told me, it's like, look, you're a genius with 1,000 helpers. That is not where you want to be, because then you will be forced to do everything. And as soon as I let that go and was able to say, you know what, they're going to do what they're going to do. I should provide them guidance. I should be able to lead them to become better than I am, because I don't spend 40 hours a week on their thing. That's what I pay them for. As soon as I made that shift from here, let me do it, or let me help you and really heavy-handedly help them, to letting them do things that may not have been quite up to the standard I was used to, but coaching them to get there. Now every single employee in their respective works is doing better than I could do on my own. And so it took a lot for me to step back and realize that, and continually go through that in my mind and realize that. And so that's where it kind of started for me.
So it sounds like philosophy gave you patience and humility.
That's right. Yeah, that's a good way to summarize it. That's true.
Yeah, and I think that's hard for someone like me who's an only child, who's always done everything himself. When I'm working in a group, I often want to dominate, and I want to do it the way I think it should be done, and I think my way is the best way. So I can definitely relate to that, needing to be humble and say, hey, whoa, I have this team here that's going to get us through this project. Let's all bring our skills to the table.
That's right.
And I think
and then of course, then you get greater things, right? When it's a collaborative effort between, so I make sure I only hire geniuses, right? Really smart people. And that doesn't mean school all the time either. Some of my favorite engineers I pulled out of Walmart stock boy, right? Is because, I as a not being college educated myself, I don't see that as a hang up. But I make sure that I stack the deck, like everybody in the company is a genius. And so being able to collaborate, and that collaboration creates a much better projects. And that was a problem with me too. I mean, that's my personality. I don't know if you're familiar with DISC scores. It's something the business community uses, DISC.
Mm-hmm.
And both my intellectual drivers and dominance drivers were at damn near 100%. My D was 100%, which the business coach said he never really saw, followed by 98% of my intellectual driver. And so I got to fight myself with that a lot. Being that domineering, it's a detriment. It can be not a great thing. So I've had to move from warrior to king. That's kind of the mentality that I've placed to it. Warrior is all about getting it done, win at all costs, pushing through, working, 80 hours a week, grinding and hustle. The king's more patient, empathetic, seeing, a team effort. and making sure that the people that are doing the work have the tools they need. You know, I talked a lot about in company organizational chart, even when I was young, even when I was still naive, but saying, look, it's not a pyramid. I'm not at the top. I don't give a shit. I'd rather be successful than right. It's a tree. I'm at the bottom. I'm in the dirt. I'm providing the substance needed for everyone else to bear fruit. And so, you know, that helped a lot.
You're the root that grows the branches, which would be your employees that can then bear the fruit of providing profit and the ability to grow your company.
That's right.
Yeah, that's awesome. And so for me, philosophy was allowed me to see that I had been letting others tell me what to do. So for me, I was ingrained with this idea that the only way to be successful was to go into STEM. And that's not necessarily true. There are different paths to success. That's just one of them. And so my skills, standardized testing wise, had always been verbal and written communication, reading comprehension, and writing. Those were my strong suits, those three things. So that would gear me towards law, like you said earlier, or towards, you know, sort of a philosophy or some sort of marketing and communications. But that was not a path to success in K-12 education. They didn't, except for lawyer. They told you, you know, you've got to focus on science and math. And it was sort of overemphasized to only focus on one area, science and math. Whereas, you know, if you focus on reading comprehension, you can be an English teacher, but that's all you're ever going to be. You know, you weren't encouraged to explore.
You know, I have a big problem with pigeonholing people, especially youth. And as much as I love Harry Potter, man, that damn sorting hat is a perfect example. You are stuck in a house at 11 years old, and that is who you are. And children will adapt to that. And they'll take that. They'll say, that is who I am. And they'll accept that as their identity. And then that's the path they travel, whether it's art or science or math or reading or writing, creative expression, whatever it is. And then there are a number of genius things that people can be that our society doesn't look at as very successful because it's not very fruitful in our capitalist system. And I think all those things are dangerous. I think that what we really should be doing is introducing the youth to multiple facets. And, you know, and luckily for me, the identity that I stuck myself with early on was this idea of a polymath. I was really interested in Da Vinci and all the aspects that he was able to touch on in his life, whether it was art or science or math or reading. And so skills acquisition was kind of how I viewed myself. Like, I'm going to go learn how to play baseball and I'm going to be the best. And I'm going to go learn chess and I'm going to destroy the math kids. It was the high D, really, right? This competitive spirit that I had. But I think that was a real positive thing for me in that I now can take multiple disciplines of seemingly unrelated subjects and use them together to solve incredibly complex problems, like systems architecture and business or chemistry or, you know, like running a business. Holy cats. So I think we need to introduce that to the kids, this idea of, you know, you don't have to go, like, everybody's like aiming towards a career. That's ridiculous. I've had 4 careers, like full 4-fledged careers that other people would have said, I made it, I'm done. This is what it'd be for the rest of my life. And I ended up getting bored and being like, nah, I'm gonna go do this other thing. I have this passion for something else. This fluidity. We do not teach fluidity. And I think that that's a major detriment as well.
Be like water. It's ready to move mountains. You can strike it 1,000 times and it never falters.
That's right. Bruce Lee.
Yep, exactly. I love that. And I've got him over on my bookshelf. I read that as a kid, and, you know,
Tao of Sun Tzu or Tao of Jeet Kune Do.
Yeah. And it's, for me, that competitive spirit was, I'm going to dominate in spelling bees and geography bowls. You know, for me, it was this trivia idea. And so I love trivia. And then it was, I'm going to be the best essay writer in high school, and I'm going to be the class clown. So for me, my interests were I want to be a comedian. I also want to be a great writer. I also want to be a trivia master. So it was like I want to dominate all of these areas. And they're not necessarily financially fruitful, but they're super interesting to me. And I really am not going to let other people tell me what to do anymore like I did for 22 years. And I'm only 23, but I realized for 22 years, I let everyone else tell me how to live my life. I let my mom pick my major in college.
Wow.
You know?
Well, the fact that you even have to pick a major in college is, I have a problem with that.
Yeah, I know. It's like, but I think being conscious of these things has allowed me to grow more as a person in the last year when I was trapped inside and had to do some introspection than I would have if I hadn't had that opportunity.
Yeah. Well, you're farther along on that journey than I was, and you're half my age. So by the time I was your age, I was married with a kid, working a minimum wage job in a factory with no education, and I'm dyslexic. That's kind of how my story started. And so, you were young as hell, man. You've got a whole lifetime. You can reinvent yourself 20 times between then and now.
Well, that's really encouraging to hear because I wouldn't say I'm mildly dyslexic as well. And that comes from my mom.
Not if you were doing spelling bees.
Yeah. Well, I would mix up the letters. That was something I had to overcome. So like I would never get my left and right correct.
Yeah.
As a kid. So I would always say the opposite. And so for me, the spelling bee was, I'm going to beat this.
Yeah.
And I would misspell things until I was 7 years old. I couldn't spell. So that
Still
was
can't
like,
spell.
I want to dominate. It's like, I want to overcome this. And I think you and I share that spirit of like, I don't care what challenges I'm going to have. If I'm working in a factory and I'm making minimum wage, I'm going to beat the system.
Yeah.
So can you walk me through that journey with the details that you're comfortable with? Because I know you said earlier you don't want your identity out there for the world, but could you give me kind of a journey from minimum wage factory worker married with kids to the success that you are today?
Yeah. 21, no college, dyslexic, grinding on aluminum parts for minimum wage, new wife, new baby. 6 months of that, and I ended up moving into warehouse management just because of work ethic. Them seeing that I cared about the company and the work that I did. There was a spot that opened up. So that was my first kind of management position. I moved from a factory to a chemical manufacturing plant where I kind of restructured their warehouse. I was hired to be their warehouse manager. Mm-hmm. And I realized at like 22, I was at the top of my game, right? With no college, it was unlikely that I was going to, grow into an executive position from the warehouse position. And I needed more cash. And I saw that there was an opportunity on the chemical manufacturing floor to scrub pots for more money than I was doing managing the warehouse. Mm-hmm. So I befriended the director on the chemical manufacturing floor and convinced him to allow me to switch jobs, get a bit of a raise, and scrub pots. The chemists would leave their books around, and I just would take them home and I just comb through them. So I taught myself organic chemistry and biomedical chemistry. And then there was an opportunity. One of the chemists quit right before a big shipment of something was due. And the director didn't have anybody to do it and said, look, I know you've been studying this stuff. I'm going to give you very specific step-by-step instructions. Would you be able to come in over the weekend and make this batch of chemical? Yeah, sure. And so I made the batch of chemical, and he then submitted that to QA under his own name, and then was praised by the CEO having been the best batch of that brand of chemical made since the CEO made it himself. And that individual got up, grabbed me, came back into the meeting and said, nah, I didn't make it. Joe made it. And the CEO was pissed because I had no college. And he told me when I was promoted into the chemical manufacturing floor, you'll never make chemical in my company. I'm giving you this promotion, but it's bullshit. You have no college. Don't expect to do anything more than scrub pots. Mm. So he was really upset that that this individual let me make the chemical and that it was so good. But he didn't stop the manager from promoting me into a chemical engineer. So for about 6 or 8 months, I was making standard chemical on the floor. Again, it's a recipe, right? I mean,
Mhm.
you're plus or minus grams on your measurements, but for the most part, it's just calculating out moles and, figuring out how much juice you need and adding that stuff in and doing tests in between, a test for moisture and variance and watching your exotherm and all that stuff. All pretty basic stuff. But because I was never taught, my lab notebooks were pretty extensive because I was very interested in data and data analytics.
Okay.
And so I was drawing charts and graphs and like analyzing things and how I can make it better. And is there things I could switch? Is there processes? Because I was always kind of process engineer minded. That's how I got to be a warehouse manager, because I understood process.
Yeah.
One day I came in and the director of R&D pulled me into his office, and he had all my lab notebooks in his office, like all over his desk. They were all open to various pages, and I thought I was going to be in trouble. I was like, what the hell did I do? And he said, where'd you learn all this? I said, I kind of made it up. I learned the basics through the books, and I'm just interested in the data. He's like, we don't do this. I'm like, okay. Like, I'm thinking I'm getting in trouble. He's like, we need this. Everybody that I have are PhDs, and they've all been trained to do things one way, and I can't get them out of it. And he himself was a dual PhD in chemistry and biomedical.
So kind of, it's sort of, even in higher education, you can be indoctrinated into, this is how we do things.
The lane, stay in your lane.
Yeah.
And don't, you can say critical thinking. What they lack is creative thinking, right?
Yeah. And so you need critical and creative. You need to be able to put those two things together to combine yourself into a builder.
And to make something new.
Yep.
That's right. And so he recognized that. And so he pulled me in, and I became an R&D biomedical polymer chemist working side by side with dual PhDs who spent 8 years in college to get that lab coat. And here I am in under 18 months, and I earned myself a lab coat. And that was a blast.
Yeah.
The problem was QA. I didn't know what the hell I was doing. So I'm making chemical, trying to figure things out. I'd send it to the lab. It'd take 3 days to get my results back, during which I'm just playing, right? I'm like sketching in my lab notebook, and I'm like playing with different chemical, trying to do other things. Finally, I got frustrated, and I walked into the QA department. I'm like, what are you guys doing? I'm a process engineer first. Please tell me what you're doing so I can help you. And they showed me everything that they were doing. And I learned in 6 weeks how to program so that I could reduce that process from 3 days to 6 hours. As I did that, and it got half of the QA department fired. So technology, as far as efficiency, though, that was my first little taste in that. But as I was going through that process, I learned what I love most are iterative cycles. These constant iterative cycles of improvement. And my frustration from chemistry is that my iterations were 3 days. But now with computers, my iterations were nanoseconds. I could make a change, I could hit go, and I could watch the result. And so I fell in love with computer programming.
So you're a systems guy in a sense. You're software system oriented. And so now you've kind of transferred into this systems-based software company. Is that correct?
No, we do line of business stuff, but
okay, gotcha.
But I'm talking about the process of coding, right?
Okay, so I'm sorry, this is not my lane, so I want you to fill
Sure.
Yeah.
All right. So you can basically open up a project, type in a bunch of lines of code, and then hit go. And then if something doesn't work, you can change it and then hit go. Right. So these constant iterative cycles of improvement. Okay. And this is where I kind of started formalizing my personal philosophy that I call incrementalism. I'm actually documenting it now, but I'm moving towards like making this a real thing. But at this time, falling in love with computer programming, I went in deep, and within 6 months, I left the lab to go work for a Fortune 500 company slinging code, which of course, all the PhDs were like, what the hell, dude? How could you just walk in here and then just walk out?
That's kind of a strength though, in a way, because in negotiation, they always teach you got to be the one that's willing to walk away.
That's right. That's right. And so I started slinging code for Fortune 500 company. Absolutely loved it. It was the best thing. I could make such massive improvements to people's lives just by changing a little bit of code or a little bit of UI. And then I got cancer in 2000. And this time my wife and I had 2 kids. I was doing really well financially because, engineers get paid well, especially if you're decent. Mm-hmm. And I was killing it. And, cancer kind of opened my eyes. I'd always wanted to be an entrepreneur. I had started early on as a studio engineer, mixing boards and mixing, I worked with Quincy Jones on a Grammy record. I worked with Barrett Jones, who did Foo Fighters and Presidents of the United States in Seattle. And so I was, from an engineering point of view, I was always kind of that engineer mindset. And I always wanted to start my own business. At that time, I wanted a music production company, signing bands and whatnot. Gave that up right in my youth as my family started to grow. But after I came out of cancer, I realized, what's the worst that can happen if I start my own business? All right, I'm not going to die. I already dodged that bullet. What's the worst that can happen? Mm-hmm. And so I dedicated my next 2 years to working toward a very small company to learn what it would take to really build a business. And so again, just like everything else, I started reading, picking up books, started, diving on the internet and learning what it meant to own a business and grow a business. And then in, early 2000s, I started one of the very first online line of business companies. And we've been doing that for 17 years. And now we have 30 employees and we do really well. And I've loved that. For those 17 years, it's been a life passion of mine. And the systems architecture that I created is completely non-standard. Best practice, I throw best practices out the window. But the architecture and frameworks that my developers use allow us to go 12 times faster than our competitors. I've got competitors with 250 employees, and they can't keep up with us on the technical front. Just because of our foundations, our first principles, if you will, of what we build our technology on.
Well, that's cool. So I was on with the systems idea. I was just off with you talking about coding.
Yeah.
So I was right about the system. I saw your brain moving and I was like, oh, this guy I look at philosophical systems rather than coding systems, but we're in the same ballpark.
I look at everything systems, right? Yeah. It was how I got to be a warehouse manager because I was a systems engineer. It was how I got to be a chemist because I saw the systems of chemistry. It's how I got to be a computer engineer because I saw the systems of computer, and now I see the systems of business, right? Each time building up from a first principle, deriving further complex ideas. And so that's kind of the journey there. Now, with TikTok exploding the way they do, my distaste of the science denial over the last 20 years, which fully came to a head with this pandemic, because a lot of my business's clients, believe that COVID was a hoax. And yet, as the CEO, it's not like I can be very public about where I stand on the political spectrum or where I stand as far as their idiotic approach to COVID. It's not good for the business. Nope. So here I am, not able to talk about their misguided BLM opinions, toward their complete science denial with COVID, and forcibly not being able to speak about it. And it grew like a cancer. And it was just so frustrating. And I really started to dislike working that every day without an outlet. And so my marketing manager came to me and was like, hey, Joe, TikTok's going to start allowing for advertising pretty soon. And we master Facebook and all the other social media platforms for the business. Like, it's a very small niche, but we're the digital media king in that industry by far. Like, no one even comes close. And he said, go check out TikTok, see if it's a viable format for us. And I was there for a week And I'm like, yeah, this is not gonna, there's no in. This is like Reddit, right? I can't figure out how to market on Reddit, right, correctly. And so TikTok's kind of the same way. You can pitch to the people that are there, but you can't necessarily build a specific audience towards, especially B2B, which is what we do, business to business. And so TikTok's really not for that. But when I was there, it kind of blew up. This whole philosophy, science, epistemology kind of thing blew up. And it gave me that outlet. And so now I've been going through this existential crisis. When I hit about 40,000 follows, I spent about 3 days, built the website, got a podcast going, got the a more formalized approach to what I'm looking at, got my business license for Formal Thought Labs, put that whole thing together in less than a week, top to bottom. And then, of course, now with the holidays and the craziness over the failed coup, I've been taking a little bit of a break before I hit it hard this year. But it gave me that outlet. And now I'm looking at a new mission in life, trying to promote critical thinking and formal logic.
So your business is your financial fruit, but then you've got this meaning. You've added this meaning to your life with promotion of philosophy through. I think TikTok is a platform for individuals. It's not a platform for businesses.
That's right.
And so, like you said, you can't, as a business, make it viable, but as an individual, you can make it viable to promote.
Apparently, Yeah, I had no. Going into it, I had no idea about what it was going. I kind of let the audience take me there, right? Mm-hmm. I started with a couple quantum physics videos and then started talking. I was like, I'm thinking I'm going to start talking about logical fallacies and critical thinking a little bit. And then it just continued to explode. And the interactions that I have with most of the people there, just phenomenal, which has helped drive the path. Like, oh, maybe I do need to formalize incrementalism. I can get it written down, identify those 4 first principles and really, build some meat onto this. And so that's what the last 3 months has really been about.
So did that philosophy of incrementalism, was it inspired to kind of oppose the idea of Marx where he said we need to revolutionize and tear everything down from the top?
Not specifically. It wasn't against anything. It was simply codifying my life's journey.
Ah, okay. So, and I love in your life's journey where the facing death gave you the courage to follow your dream.
Yeah.
It gave the hero's journey. I mean, you've literally lived the hero's life where you've looked at death in the face and said, not today.
Yeah. And I don't want to make light of the passion and meaning that my business has given me over 17 years as well. It's just that it's taken a severe hit recently, based off many of my clients and even some of my business partners' view on the pandemic. And it took the wind out of my sails a little bit as far as my purpose. And now having found this potential, nothing's really come of it yet, right? But this potential other path that I have, just like before, it's like, I'm willing to leave the lab coat. I'm willing to leave the keyboard, as it were, and look at conquering education now and seeing if that is an area where I can make a difference.
And it's something I'm passionate about too. And what's interesting to me is that TikTok's AI sort of groups people, and your first video came up the first day you posted it.
Oh, the very, very first one? My one where I was talking about how amazing TikTok was?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so your video came up and I was like, who is this guy? Immediately follow your journey through taking it from epistemology to formal logic to quantum physics, integrating all these things. And then I'm like, I've got to have this guy on my podcast, because what I did during the pandemic was sort of similar in the fact that I looked at how much time I had wasted in college and how many opportunities I had let fly out the door because of fear. Yeah. Because I was a perfectionist. And so I can't do that unless it's perfect. And so I let all these opportunities for growth pass me by. And I said, I am not going to waste this year. I'm going to do something.
Oh, and see, that's interesting that you say that, because incrementalism is totally against this idea of let's release it when it's perfect. Let's push it when it's perfect. Let's get to the state of nirvana and then move forward. No, screw that, man. No. Start somewhere, because part of incrementalism is about collaboration. And if you're going to try to gain perfection in a vacuum, like developing a piece of software, you're an idiot. Because until you get it in front of the users to tell you what they want, then you don't know what they want. And so getting it to them as quick as possible, to have them as part of the journey and make those little incremental adjustments as you move forward. Now, some people will say, like you had asserted, is it against revolution? Maybe like what Marx teaches in late stage capitalism. And I would say, no, the increment isn't defined in incrementalism. It can be as big or as small as possible. The idea, though, is that as you gain more knowledge, as you gain more resources, as you gain more collaboration, you're then able to adjust. You don't have to keep your same North Star the whole time. Too many people will take an idea on Monday and hold it all the way through Friday, no matter what happens on Wednesday. Right. And if you get new info on Wednesday, guess what? You got to change. Yeah. This is the evolution of science. You look at one of my favorite examples is gravity. Like Newtonian mechanics describes gravity on Earth perfectly. We can use it for everything. It's way easier than general relativity. But it didn't, and it allowed us to predict Uranus. We found Uranus because of Newtonian mechanics.
Yep.
It couldn't describe Mercury's precession in its orbit.
Nope.
It failed. And what happened was then Einstein comes up with this new idea of gravity, comes up with a new field equations for general relativity, and not only was able to derive all of Newtonian mechanics, but also explain the precession of Mercury's orbit. That was an incremental change, a significant and leap in increment, but it was still an incremental change, which built upon the previous ideas and changed where the North Star was.
Which was also able to allow us to codify this idea of space-time rather than space and time.
That's right.
Relativity.
At least as our current idea, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that may not be right. We still are missing huge amounts of matter and energy in the universe based off of GR. So we're missing something. Right. And maybe space-time isn't the right idea. Maybe Einstein came about the field equations through this idea of space-time and the folding and movement of matter within it. Maybe that's not the right picture, or maybe it's close and we still need more increments to go.
Yeah. And so I wanted to give you one nerdy quantum physics question. I've been developing, I'm definitely a novice dabbler in quantum physics, and I don't understand a lot of things, but I've been playing with the hard problem and looking at it as perhaps consciousness is what unifies and defines these equations of quantum mechanics. And so perhaps consciousness, as we know, we are a field of energy and matter. And so perhaps our consciousness, and, mystics have for years been able to say that we are as the observer, we change our environment. Quantum mechanics says when you look at 2 points, you can't define them unless there's two. You can't define which one's moving this way and which one's moving this way. They have to be in terms of each other. So perhaps what we need is some sort of unified theory to, once we understand, I think the missing key is our physiology. I don't think our physiology has gone deep enough yet. I think once we have our physiological and we understand our brain better, I think the problem is we don't understand our brain. And I think once we understand our brain, we'll be able to understand how we perceive the world, and we'll be able to solve the hard problem. Do you have any thoughts on that?
A handful. One, the first being the human brain, which then the mind is an emergent quality, and consciousness, from what we can tell, is an emergent quality. The brain is the most complex thing in the entire known universe.
Yep.
It is far more complex than a black hole or the dance of the celestial bodies of the quantum realm. It is right now beyond, consciousness is beyond our comprehension. And so I hear your mystical bias popping in there a little bit,
Yes.
right? We have no evidence because we have no idea what consciousness is, that consciousness is a requirement of the universe to function, nor was it present during the first 13 billion years of its existence. And so my leaning towards a more reductionist point of view, if you were to classify me that way, you can take in quantum mechanics the word observation, which people get really confused, especially when you're talking about entanglement or Bell's inequality. Yeah. And you can take observation and replace it with interaction. Because what is observation other than our five senses receiving information from something else? A photon has to bounce off a thing in order for it to get to us. The photon still bounces regardless of our ability to perceive that photon. So it's the interaction of the photon to the quantum realm that happens, that makes a thing move out of its superposition, right? What we call collapses the wave function. And so it's not observation that collapses the wave function, but interaction. And that interaction can happen with any other particle in the known universe. It doesn't have to be behind a conscious entity, doesn't have to be behind it. Okay. So my answer to your question is, I don't know, right? We don't know because we don't understand consciousness. We don't understand the brain. And we think we've got a pretty good understanding of what happened prior to our existence as humans, as bacteria, as Earth at all. 13 billion years, things were happening.
Protozoa to bacteria to,
Yeah, I mean, of course, we don't know abiogenesis either, right? We can talk about that. But all of those physical qualities, those suns came into existence and then were destroyed, which made up the matter which now makes us us, far before the earth was ever formed. And so those things are universally known to be true. So that's kind of where I'm at, is my thought is that consciousness is not a required element of the universe's existence. And the quantum state that I won't say witness, because that's a really bad word, because we can't witness anything that is a factor smaller than the smallest energy we can give a photon. That's not required. There's no consciousness there required. The sun is a perfect example. The sun requires quantum mechanical properties. If the sun were to burn up the hydrogen just as we understand the burning of hydrogen, it would have expended its fuel millions of years ago, billions of years ago. The reason why the sun continues to burn at a very slow rate, comparatively, is because it requires quantum tunneling. It requires this idea of, let's say you put an electron in a box. There is a non-zero value that electron will suddenly be outside of the box, that it will just appear outside of the box. It's a non-zero number. And that is what fuels the sun. That electron pops outside of the box and then is able to have its energy released in the form of heat and photons.
So to go back earlier, I was making the tail wag the dog with consciousness.
That's right.
I was making it a required element of the universe because of my mystical and anthropocentric bias. So therefore you need iron sharpens iron, right? You need another critical thinker to look at you and say, hey, buddy, maybe it's interaction, not observation.
That's right.
And so this is how we grow, is conversation. And I think we need to encourage that.
Well, Tyrion Lannister said that the history of man can be explained by great conversations in elegant rooms.
Yep.
That's exactly right.
Yep.
That's exactly right.
And right now that elegant room has to be Zoom.
That's right. Totally.
Well, it's been lovely, man. Is there anything else you wanted to shout out or bring attention to before we get out of here? I think it's almost 5 o'clock and I don't want to take up too much of your time today.
Oh, no, I think we've covered a lot of things, and I really appreciate you having me on and what you're trying to do. So I support your efforts.
Well, I support your efforts too, and I appreciate you taking the time to be on my show today. And I want to give another shout out to formalthoughtlabs.com. And did you want to maybe elaborate on the Fight Club and the blog and the podcast a little before we get out of here?
Yeah, I mean, obviously I have a real job, so that kind of stuff goes slow. It's a passion project, but everything can be found on the website. The links to TikTok, which obviously is the biggest audience at the moment, YouTube channel, which holds the video version of the podcast. The podcast is on there as well as links to Twitter, where I've been lately calling out treasonous activity, and and then to Instagram, where I'm a lot more gentle, where I'm just posting basically philosophical and scientific pictures with quotes. So yeah, and there is a Discord channel which has grown, and I don't spend hardly any time there, and I need to. Mm-hmm. I want to. We have a committee that we're building, and we're going to start doing formal debates over Discord. We're calling them kind of like the Fight Club for debate, and happy to have you. I think there's like 200 plus people there now, looking for our first debate here shortly. And I might mix it up. I might bring people in who want to debate and then randomize which side of the argument you get. So, more traditional kind of collegiate style, like you come in saying, I firmly don't think healthcare is a right. It's like, okay, I'll make you argue the opposite. Be prepared, right? Yeah. And so you want to talk about critical thinking, proving yourself wrong, setting out to prove yourself wrong and some of your beliefs that help drive your behavior. That's the best way to approach it.
That's the idea of steel manning the opponent rather than straw manning.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
That's awesome, man. I'll definitely jump in on that Discord server. And what was the name of your YouTube channel so I can put the link below my video when I post it?
It's all this can be found on FTL. And I think it's let me see here, jump into YouTube, and Formal Thought Labs.
Awesome. Yep. Great, man. Well, thank you again for your time, and critical thinkers, stay strong out there. Peace, everyone.
Thank you, Hayden. Have a great day.